Very pleased to have our first Opera 101 of the season, our 51st season. So thank you for being here. We've got a wonderful panel set presented today. We've got people that are actually in the productions. There'll be lots of secrets to be told, I'm sure. We'll start off with Stephan Bonfield, who's a moderator.
So, going back a ways, how did we get to the phenomenon of Barber? What's it about? Well, let's start at the beginning. There was a time when comedy really wasn't seen as an elevated art form whatsoever. It might be an elevated art form in theater, for example, in France, with Molière's plays and a whole variety of other great French, remarkable writers, and the creation of characters that we now know as comédie dell'arte, or characters that have particular stock roles. In fact, being invented in France was a very, very important part of the industry of theater. And that industry spilled over into opera in general. And what happened in the 18th century was that those characters became a great way to actually center a drama and then spice it up with something funnier and turn it into something that was more about entertainment that did not necessarily have to end with the tragic death of a hero or a heroine. Comedy then takes this interesting route out of drama and out of the stage, but it grows very, very slowly. It's still the second-class citizen. It's the weaker cousin in musical performance for quite some time, until about the middle of the century. And without having to gloss or skip too much, I mean, we could go on for quite a while and discuss this, but certainly there was a very, very important comedy called La Serva Padrona, in which a young girl decides that she's going to insinuate herself into her boss's household by telling him what to do all the time and making herself so indispensable that he realizes he finally just has to marry her. And of course, this is how she actually, in some ways, then makes the happy ending come about for herself, but even genuinely because she actually loves him. But this is a very, very important deconstruction of class, because a servant could never ever be seen or depicted on stage as having that kind of cunning or that kind of deviousness that she could outwit someone who was educated and perhaps in a borderline nobility. So this was, I mean, I'm speaking as generally as possible about this. Of course, these things have greater specifics to them, but just moving through the history of comedy, one of the elements that advanced it a great deal was actually seeing the breakdown between the division of classes. And this is something that I think that two of our members of our panel, namely our director, Alison Grant, and also our U of A doctoral candidate, Anna Wells, is going to talk about with some degree of, I think, fluency that will really shed light on the stories that have led to the Barber of Seville, which is the prequel, of course, to Mozart's Marriage of Figaro and those Beaumarchais classics. So there's roots to this kind of division of class that began to be emulated, and that after the 1750s began to enter into the consciousness of a few, at least, people even outside of Paris. When La Serva Padrona, which was forgotten after the composer Pergolesi died in the 20s, made it to Paris in the early 1750s, it caused an enormous press war. It was huge. Which side were you on? Were you on the side that actually believed that this could be true and that new music that could vaunt this into something of a new stratospheric art form was possible? Or did you want to go back to being a traditionalist? And even the philosophers took sides as well. The very famous philosophers, the philosophes of the time, became completely embroiled in this, what got called to be the War of the Buffoons. And of course, the buffoons is an Italian and a French word, a bouffon, for a comic actor. So it's a nice play-on word for us today. So comedy actually was propped up somehow, or should we say at least it was put into this new level of awareness. But then also in the 50s, at that time, there was a new taste that was developing, that comedy would actually turn from being about basic slapstick and small little stories with little happy endings into something that could become satirical commentary. Satire was new to the public in the 1740s and 50s in that very, very direct way. If there was political satire, for example, in Handel operas in the 1720s, when he was at his absolute apex of creative power, then it was always seen in a figure such as, say, Julius Caesar, So in Giulio Cesare, his absolute marquee opera that went all over Europe, was hugely famous. It was fashionable to actually see Caesar as a representative, perhaps, of a good ruler, telling off a bad ruler like Ptolemy and an analogous bad ruler of the time in Europe as having some sort of political counterpart or a political thread that could be weaved. But this sort of metaphorical content never really made it into comedy until the mid-century in the comedies of Goldoni. But after that, it really took until Mozart to really change comedy and make it into something so much bigger than it had ever been before. Comedy has ridden kind of a wave, a crest and a trough through the decades in the 18th century. When we finally get to the end of the 18th century in Mozart, by the time we get to about 1800, we're finding that comedy is on its way back down again. And Mozart had created such stunning, stunning pieces. Marriage of Figaro, of course, changed music forever. In particular, those great comic centerpiece ends of acts. The end of Act 2, for example, is absolutely de rigueur. It's compulsory study for anybody who goes to music school, for any conductor, for any musicologist, because there was no conductor, there was no composer after Figaro who did not study how to make 20 minutes of continuous music without any recitatives work so magnificently well. It was fascinating to watch that sustained amount of creativity just take hold on stage. And there was no composer after that who did not want to somehow imitate that in some way. So comedy took a completely different detour at that point. And instead, now we were talking about an art form that wasn't really interested in the comedy so much, but the comedy was being co-opted into opera in a very, very different way. Well, as is always the case, economic times, fashion changes. The Napoleonic Wars were bad for theaters, and many theaters did not survive. So by the time Rossini came around, after the Napoleonic Wars, it's about 1815, writing a comedy is a hard thing to do. It's thriving in certain small centers in Italy, but it's by no means thriving ubiquitously. So the first thing he's asked to do is write Italian Girl in Algiers, and this really completely changes his career. Right away, almost right away, he's asked to write Barber of Seville. So Barber is one of those things, it's one of those miracle pieces you hear about where he writes the whole opera in 2 weeks, more or less. And 98% of the music is freshly composed. Of course, one of the great comedies after that is Donizetti's great L'Elisir d'Amore. And Donizetti wrote that in about 8 or 9 days. And when he was told that Rossini wrote Barber in 2 weeks, Donizetti sniffed and said, well, Rossini was being lazy. So it also becomes part of the fashion to sort of say, well, it's a comedy, I'll just sort of say, okay, I can write this and it'll be just fine. So it almost gives us or lends us a sense that maybe we just don't have to be too serious about this as an art form. It gets written quickly, it's just simply done, almost as if it's divinely inspired, and there isn't much thought that goes into it, and really nothing can be further from the truth. There's absolutely nothing can be further from the truth. This is extremely special music. It is remarkable because at this point in time, what is allowing these pieces to survive is the form. It's the construction of how they're put together. And it is also a construction of a very fine libretto, of course, but it's also appealing to the changes that are being made to how the singer is being involved in these very, very interesting pieces. So we have kind of 3 stories that we're following. If you want to stage Barber, you're always keeping in mind, how is the singer being challenged, maybe for the first time, not the individual, but in history? And then secondly, how is the comedy itself being brought to the fore at that time, and how do we reinterpret it? And then thirdly, how do we put it together as a unified complexity, as a structure? And so, in so many ways, we have to look at the interesting use of character, the interesting use of finale and ensemble piece, and then finally, of course, the interesting use of how to put it together as one original package structure. All of that made Barber famous. This is what makes Barber original and fresh for its time. There was no other art work that I can think of that had reached that height or that level of interest. When Rossini moved on to Naples, he actually started to compose larger ensemble sections and pieces. But I think it's with Barber that gave him that impetus to do that. Barber was almost his test piece to make these works come together in a new way. The characters in Italian Girl in Algiers and in Barber of Seville are stock characters in many ways. And they do actually take us back to any of us here who knows our Shakespeare, to basic ideas of boy meets girl, boy loves girl, girl falls in love with boy, girl's father comes along and says to boy, get lost, you're not good enough for my daughter. Boy runs away shaking fists saying, just you wait, I'll prove to you that I am. And then somewhere in the middle section, there's an unlikely series of events where boy actually somehow through the darkest of times proves his worth. And then by the end, of course, we have the happily ever after comic archetype called a wedding. So most everything really revolves around that in some way. So in so many respects, the characters' names, the characters' functions, the characters' exactitudes of roles don't always conform to the story, but they're very approximate. Barber of Seville is that story. Except that maybe the dark times of separation between boy and girl aren't quite so bad, because our Count Almaviva never really actually goes away very far. And when he does come back, it's always in disguise, which is always only what makes it all the more interesting. In fact, what happened initially was that there was a Barber of Seville before Barber of Seville by Paisiello. Rossini is that he was a humble enough man and also a scared enough man to not call it the Barber of Seville right away. He called it Almaviva, in fact, and just sort of centered it on this count. And he centered it, of course, on not just thinking about the Beaumarchais play, but using that as premise. And he centered it on this person who seems like a cheerful cove, you know, who just sort of comes along and seems like a nice enough guy and falls in love with this beautiful woman and tries his very, very best to marry her and get through the brick wall that's known as the isolation fortress of Bartolo's house. And the whole premise is trying to just get inside this house. And his first disguise as Lindoro is wonderful. I mean, Lindoro, lin as in linen, as in pants, and oro, gold. So, you know, really it's in a way, gold pockets is what Lindoro means. So it's kind of a way of testing by disguising himself as someone poor, so that Rosina will fall in love with him anyway and not fall in love with just his money. So in other words, it's a kind of precaution to make certain that, you know, that really the love is going to be legitimate. So everything really turned on this idea. And that was much more, I think, the central premise of this kind of Barber. Eventually, when it was remounted a year later, I believe in Bologna, I think he changed the title back to, you know, Barber of Seville, and that's really where the title came from. So the characters are stock, but in many ways they're reinvented. They're invented anew. And in another sense, too, the ensemble pieces that are so large scale center around the shtick, partly, but also the sense of challenging the voice, challenging the interaction between the characters to do something novel or apparently novel on stage, such as while Figaro is shaving Bartolo, there is this sort of proxy music lesson going on. It's really not a music lesson at all. And so there's so many different ways to stage that, and this is a rather remarkable scene where you have sort of two comedies playing out against one another at the same time. This would have been highly novel to have that take place and yet write music that would allow for that compatibility between the two shtick scenes that are fused together. There's also another feature too in Italian music, and especially in Italian drama, that passes in the sense of caratteri, of these stock characters. And this is the Zani, with the Z-A-N-I. This is where we get our word zany from. The Zani is kind of like the crazy character that is more than just beyond comic, but almost as borderline lunatic. And the Zani, in so many ways, is really the whole situation. And one of the things that is very, very hard for us to understand, particularly at the end of Act 1, is there's this incredible build-up, kind of what is really referred to as the Rossini crescendo, you know, a second generation of crescendo types. And in this Rossini crescendo, the rhythm repeats incessantly. It comes back again and again and again and again, where everybody suddenly comes to this moment of revelation where the town guards are called in because there's been a lot of noise in the house, and Bartolo is expecting this upstart Lindoro to be carried off, and instead Lindoro, perhaps by our standards, shows the ID, and then the guards say, you know, it's the Count, sort of thing. And suddenly, inexplicably, he's not arrested, and the whole cast is dumbfounded. They freeze on stage, and they sing a giant imitative polyphonic fugal-style piece, which is the thing to do when we're all confused. We stand around and sing a fugue. I mean, I know I do in my kitchen. It's like I just sing to myself again and again. I don't believe this happened. I don't believe this happened. Well, it's going. But I mean, it's of course the normal thing to do is that there's just this moment in time, and it just everything stops, right? But from that builds this tremendous amount of energy, and we kind of sit and we look at this and we say, why are they all sort of saying, I can't believe my ears, and they start clutching their head and they start moving around, and it's like this big bell is going off in my head, and it's just this terrible confusion again and again and again. Well, this is part and parcel of the Italian sensibility of comedy taking you over the edge to, you know, a cliff, where your sanity just kind of successfully drives down into a steep gorge. And you feel yourself that you've been taken really into this zany zone. And part of that, I think, also drives the ensemble, that for the Italians of the day, they would have understood this, that everybody on stage was in a crazy-making situation, where there's domestic upheaval, there's social upheaval, the cops are running around the stage, you know, everything just seems to be completely upside down in this very, very respectable house. And along the way, sometimes we forget that Dr. Bartolo would have been a very, very respected member of his community, because Bartolo is often played for a complete shtick, which is fine. You know, I mean, there's so many different ways to do this. But the reality is that these characters have a dignity in their history, and the idea is to sort of push that dignity and mess with it in a certain way that allows the original genius of the comedy that Rossini is intending to come through. So for Italians looking at this and seeing this extended, enormous ensemble finale, just driven by one thing, and that's the sense that I feel that everything is losing control, this would have been irresistible for them. So it is very hard to stage. I think it's very hard to stage and to pull this off. I wouldn't want to be a director. Well, I'm sure, no, I mean, but it's a very, very tough thing to do. You know, it's not easy, and I think really, I'm actually not trying to confront Alison Grant. I'm just simply trying to say I applaud you that you actually take this on. I mean, because I think this is a very, very tough thing to actually make happen. So it's not just that we're going to go to Barber of Seville and it's all very easy, we're going to have a good time. What has to go into this, into a thoughtful presentation of this very, very ingeniously put together piece, and finding the music that moves properly without recitative, similar to the Mozart Marriage of Figaro of the mid-1780s, now to the mid-18-teens, 30 years later, to actually now get to the next stage of development in comedy. To work with these characters, to work with this construction, I think is really quite masterful. And this is why it has stayed in the repertoire for 200 years. Because we don't get tired of being shown how this, an impossible situation can really make us laugh to such a point that it doesn't really drag us down to think, I don't want to listen to this music. You want to listen to this music and see it presented in this rather constructive and remarkable manner. And it's almost addictive. The rhythms are addictive, more so even than the melodies, which are very, very beautiful. The rhythmic qualities in Rossini are highly addicting. And it isn't just a question that he knew how to write rhythms or that he studied his counterpoint really, really well. I mean, he was sort of sneered at by, in a joking way, by his teacher for studying Haydn and Mozart string quartets and saying, "Ah, Rossini, you're my little German," he used to say to him. But Rossini was so well grounded in his music compositional history that he had quite a number of arrows in his quiver that he could draw and that he could actually pull out at any time to make a large-scale work extremely well. So please, do not be deceived by, I wrote this in 2 weeks. It is really quite a masterpiece of carefully selected types of aria and ensemble construction that make this beautiful display of stock character, and as well, a very, very interesting subversive comedy in its own way, albeit in a light manner, work so assiduously well that it gave comedy new life for about 30 years, until about the mid-century. And by the time Rossini died, right before he died, he sent a letter, I believe, I can't remember if it was to Giuseppina Strepponi or to a friend that then fell into Verdi's wife's hands, saying, "I don't think Verdi will ever write a comedy." And of course, Verdi wrote 28 operas, and 2 of them were comedies. One was a terrible failure because the first one, unfortunately, failed at a time when his wife and his 2 children died on separate accounts of illness within a year and a half. It was a horribly tragic time in his young life. And the second comedy he wrote was his last opera, Falstaff, which he completed in his late 70s and was mounted when he was 80 years old. And he remarked wryly, "I guess Rossini hadn't lived long enough to see me make a comedy." So comedy really had sort of fallen off the map by about 1850. But that wonderful life that we have, thanks to Rossini, actually gives us a tremendous amount of artistic insight and a tremendous amount of personal insight as well. And I'm really grateful for those comedies and what they have inspired, and in subsequent composers, particularly Donizetti, and how beautiful they can actually speak truth about human nature through their artistic, marvelous interweaving, their tessellations of glowing orchestral sound and counterpoint, their glowing, wonderful arias, and their rich ensemble, power-packed harmonic energy. That's what we're going to see